Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hi, everyone. I'm Madison Margolin. We're here with the Set and Setting podcast, and we have Seth Ferranti as the guest today. Seth is an ex-con filmmaker who did 21 years in federal prison for a first-time nonviolent LSD and cannabis offense. He earned 3 college degrees in prison, including a master's, wrote 22 books on gangsters, drug lords, and prison gangs, founded a publishing house and website, Guerrilla Convict, and started a career as a journalist writing for Vice, Penthouse, and others. After being released, he started making films. He wrote and produced White Boy, which is currently on Netflix. He currently has numerous projects in production and development. Seth, I'm really excited to have you today. And, so the audience knows, I originally met Seth through a documentary he's working on now on the LSD trade. So before we kind of get into everything, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background, how you got here, just anything you want to share about yourself biographically, and then we'll take it from there.
All right. I grew up a military brat. My dad was in the military. I was born in 71, so I grew up in the 70s, came of age as a teenager in the 80s. And kind of bounced around. I lived in Germany for a couple years. I lived in London for a couple years. We always kept going back to California because my dad was in the Navy. So I grew up, born and raised in Southern California, except for my time overseas. And I would say, I was a typical American kid, kind of all American kid. I played sports, baseball, football, basketball, ate apple pie, and thought my country was the greatest.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And so, just even reading your bio, I was, you said you got 3 degrees while you were incarcerated. Like, what was that like, sort of continuing to like grow and build yourself in that environment? And part of it is also, this podcast kind of focuses on the legacy of Ram Dass and Be Here Now. And so what is sort of the spiritual practice that really enables you to continue to like self-realize in such extenuating circumstances?
Yeah, I would say, pretty early, I started using, cannabis and LSD at a young age, right? Like 13, 14, 15, weed at 13 and then, LSD around 15. And I think I don't want to, sound cliche and say like spiritual awakening or anything like that. But, the way our society was, especially like in the 80s, there's like a certain way, everything was. And, you're supposed to go to college, you're supposed to, get the job, have the white picket fence. That was kind of like the American dream. And when I took LSD, I kind of had, that awakening where I started questioning things. I started seeing things differently. And, indirectly, I would say that led to my prison sentence, because I always tell people I never consider myself a criminal. I consider myself an outlaw because I broke laws that I thought were wrong. And, by the time I was 15 and 16, I started selling cannabis and I started selling LSD, and mushrooms. I was a marijuana and psychedelics type of dude. I was into the counterculture. I started following the dead. And all these things like really go back to like, that spiritual awakening, that opening of my mind, that questioning of authority. I just, by the mid 80s, by the time I was, basically 15, 16, and everybody was like, this is what life is about. This is what you're supposed to do. And, opening my mind with psychedelics, I started questioning. I was like, well, why? You know, and then when you ask those questions, you know, as a 15-year-old kid, you know, in 1986, you know, to my, you know, my military dad and you know, my mom was a teacher, and I'm asking these questions, and they're telling me like, oh, you got to do this, you got to do that, you know, this is the way, and I'm saying why, and they really didn't have an answer for me, so I started looking for the answers myself, and yeah, eventually, you know, I kept selling drugs, you know, cannabis and LSD, and I got 25 years. When I was 22, you know, I was kind of like, I don't want to say the rebel without a cause, because I did have a cause, kind of cannabis and psychedelics for my cause. But, you know, I was not conforming, you know, I thought outside the box. And I think, you know, all that was because of this, you know, mind expansion that I have from taking psychedelics.
Yeah. And it feels, you know, just in the way that you describe the term outlaw, for instance, like your cause to me, you know, looking as an outsider, your cause was part of like being outside the law or outside a law that wasn't fair in your view. And that in a lot of people's views who are, you know, active against the drug war. And so like part of it is like you are embodying what it means to be an outlaw, even if it means continuing to like live that essence, you know, in an incarcerated situation. So, you know, curious, like in your psychedelic exploration, like before prison and during and after, like what relationship have you had to the work of Ram Dass and Timothy Leary, and like how has that influenced you?
Oh no, I gravitated towards that type of stuff, you know, really early. Just the whole counterculture, you know, Leary, Ram Dass, even, you know, like Hunter S. Thompson. You know, I was even into punk rock stuff like Henry Rollins. So, you know, anybody that was kind of like outside that box, I really, really gravitated to. And I can say, you know, people like Ram Dass and Timothy Leary and the whole thing like that was going on in the 60s. You know, I mean, I miss that. You know, I wasn't even born then. But, you know, in the 80s, I think we had our own little kind of thing like that, you know, because, I mean, I went on tour with the Grateful Dead, and it was just like, I mean, it was like freedom. It wasn't the same thing, but it was kind of like our version of it, you know, in the 80s. And, you know, all of me and my friends, you know, follow the dead. You know, they said, you know, they called us, you know, deadheads or whatever. But all of us, we kind of experienced this freedom. And I think that freedom, you know, freedom of thought, but also freedom of mind and body. I mean, that just epitomizes, you know, what people like Ram Dass and Timothy Leary, you know, taught and expressed, you know, because I mean, that was like the, you know, the famous saying, the Leary saying, I don't want to get it wrong, turn on, tune in, and drop out.
That's it.
So, you know, I mean, that was like that was basically, you know, we came from that lineage, you know, from the people, you know, the elders now and the people that were my age, the age that I am now, like in the 80s, you know, that's kind of who, you know, I looked up to, especially on tour, you know, like the people that were in their, you know, 40s and 50s when I was a young man, you know, like a teenager, and then in, you know, my early 20s before I caught my case, you know, those are the kind of people that I would talk to. And I wanted to know about, you know, the 60s. I wanted to know about the experience, because they were kind of, in America, that was kind of like the first group that kind of broke free, you know, of you know, the conformity, or, you know, like the conservative views, you know, of like the 40s and 50s and early 60s, and kind of what was going on in America. So I believe like through those teachers like Ram Dass and Leary, who kind of, you know, told people, you know, you need to open your mind, you need to challenge things, you know, you need to challenge authority, you need to think of things differently, you know, that kind of opened all that up. And that was really still going on when I was a teenager.
And so another question I have is, you know, Ram Dass is sort of known, his narrative is that he and Leary were doing research with psychedelics at Harvard, went too far, they got kicked out. And Ram Dass goes to India and finds more of a spiritual path that isn't as driven by acid, or doesn't revolve around acid in the same way. That's not to say he stopped doing acid actually, but just that like he found something, the idea was like finding a way to get there without necessarily having to rely on an outside substance. And so my question for you is like in the Grateful Dead community, in the psychedelic world, also through your own journalism, you're making this documentary now, like how is that received, right? Like by people for whom acid is so central to the practice and the consciousness, and then for there to be a narrative is like, no, wait, maybe we don't need this. How do people respond to that?
I mean, some people embrace it. Some people are just druggies. They like to take drugs, So, I mean, some people move on. I think you take enough drugs, sometimes you can be like, okay, well, I'm not getting what I need from this. So I have to find it a different way. And actually, I had a similar experience, like I'm not trying to liken myself to Ram Dass, but I had like about 14 years in prison where I was completely stone sober. Like I didn't even smoke weed, and everything that I needed, I was finding within myself. I didn't have to go to outside sources. And not to say, I mean, I probably, I don't know, man. I'm not going to say I tripped 1,000 times, but, I probably tripped close to that. I tripped a lot, in my teens and, before I went to prison. I had about a 5-6 year period where I was tripping on acid regularly, and I was selling a lot of acid. So I had a lot of access to LSD and good LSD. So, I opened my mind as much as the best of them. But yeah, I did have that time in prison, for like 14 years. And there were drugs around. I mean, I could have got drugs. I could have smoked weed. Weed was always around. LSD was around sometime. But I just chose, like for that 14 years, I was like, I just need to be myself, and I need to deal with everything in life. And I need to look inward, and I need to do a lot of introspection. And I think, I always like in prison. Prison is, I mean, it's definitely like a military or locker room culture, because how you have like the male alpha thing, but at the same time, you live so sparse. It's almost could be like you could relate it to like a monk, like the way a monk lives, like a Buddhist monk or something, because I mean, you just don't, everything's restricted. There's a scarcity of resources. So you live like this really kind of,
ascetic,
or Spartan kind of life. You just don't have a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have a lot of material belongings. You can only spend a certain amount of money. I mean, you have limited access to what kind of food you can get. So, so I really, in prison, I really kind of lived that life for a long time, where I really, I watched what I ate. I didn't do any type of drugs. I exercised regularly. I did yoga, I did meditation. And I think, sometimes I think now, like I'm out in the world and I'm doing all this stuff, and I'm ripping and I'm running, and I'm like, man, if I can just get back to that point. And I don't mean get back to that point in prison. I just mean get back to that point where I had that discipline, like within myself, within my body,
mm-hmm.
where my body, I felt like, super healthy, rest, I'm meditating, I'm doing yoga, I'm working out, I'm eating right. And now like in the world, it's just so hard, because you're doing, you do so much and everything moves so fast. And so like, I think all the time, I'm like, man, if I could just like slow down and get to that point. And I think somebody like Ram Dass, I think that's what he really did. He had to slow down everything, and he had to look at things a different way. And he just got to that point where he was really, self-aware, but not only self-aware, just kind of, really tranquil, like with himself and who he is and his thoughts. And, I'm saying, even though I was in the chaos of prison, I had that, for a decade or more. And that helped me, accomplish a lot of stuff I did in there with my writing and my college degrees. And it helped me, to set me up, for where I am now.
I mean, it's such a weird comparison to make, but, obviously prison isn't any sort of retreat, but I think the simplicity of life in prison, and maybe you want to walk us through a day in the life, like do they put you to work in some way? Like it seems as if because you're not out in the world, that you don't have the same distractions that you would have just in regular life, you actually have the time to sort of work on yourself in these almost forced ways, because what else is there to do? So like, yeah, I mean, it's actually extremely inspiring in the way that you're describing your experience in prison. I mean, it's probably the best you could have done in the circumstances, and maybe it's all for the better, honestly.
Yeah, no, I always, they got a saying in prison. They say, you want to do the time, don't let the time do you. So, I always took that as, I'm going to work, I'm going to read, I'm going to do everything, to fix everything inside myself. Cause I mean, all of us, we all have scars. We all have trauma. We all have stuff, that happens in our life, that we hold on to, or we won't let go, or that we, take substances to kind of escape. And, I think, when you just kind of live that life, be it, in prison or a monastery, or even, like out living out in the wilderness, like a back to the lander, or living that real kind of simple life, as a farmer or whatever, it kind of, it makes you look inward. And when you look inward, you can study everything inside yourself. And then, you can just come to the conclusion like, okay, well, whatever happened. I mean, I had a long time, I got sentenced to 25 years when I was 22. So I was extremely angry. And I'm not going to lie. I mean, I'm still angry now. My anger kind of drives me. But I mean, I had to deal with that anger so that it didn't destroy me. I had to learn to focus that anger in a productive way. I mean, because so many people in life and in prison, they let that anger, they let that hurt, they let that pain destroy them. I mean, everybody, you see it every day. People are addicted to drugs because they can't bear their life. They just want to escape. People, they just want to create chaos and drama and scream and yell and fight, because they hate themselves. And, people just have like mental illness or whatever because of the burdens that these scars or drama place on them. So I really, and it starts with the psychedelic stuff and the opening of the mind that I experienced, as a teenager. And then, it went into the prison stuff where I had the time to do the introspection. I had the time to look at myself. I had the time to become comfortable with who I am and deal with all that anger, and trauma and stuff inside me so that I didn't, self-destruct.
And how did you deal with it? Like, what did the anger work look like?
I mean, really rage. I mean, I could have, and there you see a lot of people like, they just explode, and they use violence, to, basically like let that anger out, but I decided I was going to channel that anger, and I use that anger, I use that anger to write. I use that anger to, do the college courses. I use that anger to be disciplined. I use that anger, to work out and to do everything. I use that anger almost for discipline. So I tried to focus it, in positive ways and channel it in positive ways that would help me. Because I was always, I think that's the one thing that psychedelics gave me. It gave me the abilities. I'm not like a small picture guy. I'm like a big picture guy. I see like the big vision. So, when I was in there, I was like, what can I do, for my future? I mean, okay, I had a lot of time. I had 25 years when I was 22 for a first time nonviolent offense, for substances that are legal and on their way to legality now. But, I still, I had to, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. I had to figure something out, because so many people in that situation, they just give in to their anger, or they try to escape, and, they just end up, self-destructing or destroying their lives or other people's lives. And I didn't want to be that person. So I had that foresight. And really, I think, as I'm looking back, I'm 50 years old now. So looking back, it was really the psychedelics that opened my mind and gave me that ability, to look at things from outside myself. Because I think that's the biggest problem with a lot of people. They can't look outside themselves, man. They can only feel what they feel. and think what they think. And sometimes you got to look at yourself like in a mirror. You got to look at yourself from outside, and you got to think, okay, because anything, when it's in your own brain, you can justify it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do this. But you got to look outside and think like, okay, maybe I got to look at this in a different direction.
And were there times, 25 years obviously is a long sentence, and you deal with the impatience of that. So like, that feels like a moment where like be here now really can be like a mandate and like a command, but also like something frustrating, right? Like when you're just like, I don't want to be here now. Like, I don't want to be here at all, right? Like now or ever. So like, how does be here now really play into dealing with something where you have so many years ahead of you in that same circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, basically, when you're in prison, you don't have a choice. I mean, you got to be here now. There's no alternative. It's forced upon you, and I think I really learned, to, even though I had all these goals, and I'm very, like goal orientated, and I kind of get my self-worth from accomplishing things. That's why, I'm really, really prolific in, especially like the creative endeavors that I do, because, I like to accomplish stuff, but, I like the end result. That's kind of the big thing about me. I got that big vision, and I want to complete stuff. But, at the same time, being in prison, I mean, you have to be extremely patient, man. I've learned a lot of patience in there, because I mean, you just don't have no choice. I mean, because out here, you can be impatient and, maybe bang your head against the wall or scream and yell or whatever when you don't get your way. But in there, I mean, you can't do that. If you do that in there, somebody might stab you, So, I mean, you really have to control yourself, and you have to focus. And it's like, it's like you have to discipline yourself, but at the same time, you got to, be reserved. You can't say everything you want. You can't say everything you feel. You can't even like show your emotions or what you think on your sleeve or, on your face, because sometimes if somebody does something and you get like a sour look or the wrong look on your face, they can take offense and they might want to stab you or fight you or something. So, I mean, that's just prison life. But I mean, I think I really learned to kind of live in the moment, while I was in there, and be patient and just do everything. Because I think anything in life that you accomplish, it's like one step at a time. A lot of people just want to jump right to the end.
Yeah.
They want to have an idea and they want to jump right to the end. But I really learned in there, and I think that goes right along with the be here now, that, every little step, every little increment, everything builds on the whole, and it's all cumulative. And if you keep building a little bit at a time, then you're going to get to where you're going to go, be it writing a book, be it, getting a college degree, be it, working out, either building muscle or losing weight or whatever you want to do, or even learning a craft or becoming better at something. I mean, it takes time to do that stuff. I mean, as human beings, we're all capable of doing a lot of stuff, especially if we keep practicing, but I think a lot of people, and I was like that probably before I went to prison in a way, if something didn't come easy to me, maybe I gave up, but in prison, I was like, okay, I want to do this. I want to become a writer. I want to work out. I want to be a filmmaker when I get out. So I just did every little thing I could, with the overreaching goal, being that idea I had in my head. So, it was just like step by step, day by day, minute by minute. And, and I walked down, I ended up doing 21 years, but I walked that 21 years down, day by day. Cause in there, you can't look to when you get out. You just have to do, everything in that moment. And when you're in there, the outside world and all the distractions and everything out here, it doesn't matter, man. Because, not only do you have to, worry about what you're trying to accomplish for when you get out, but I mean, you got to worry about your safety too in there. So, you got to be really in the moment.
And what, switching gears a little bit, what year did you get out?
So I got out 2015. So I went in 1993. My case is from 91. I was a U.S. Marshals Top 15 Most Wanted from 91 to 93, faked my suicide, went on the run, continued to sell marijuana for 2 more years, got busted again. They mashed up my prints, extradited me back to Virginia, gave me 304 months. That's like 25 years, 4 months. So I went in 93. I was 22, got out in 2015 when I was 43.
Wow. Okay. You faked your own suicide. That's didn't Mark Twain or someone do that? Something like that. Yeah. Or one of his characters, Tom Sawyer, I think. Something about a character went to their own funeral or something like that. But what was it like coming out? I mean, 2015, where were we in sort of the quote unquote psychedelic renaissance? I would say that even in the past 6 years, things have really things have really changed, but like you came out pretty much into a post-prohibition paradigm, at least in regard to cannabis. California legalized weed in 2016. So, what was it like coming into a new political climate, both in regard to the way cannabis is being treated and also like how much research and progress there's now being made with psychedelics?
No, it was great coming out. When I first came out, I had 5 years probation, so I couldn't even smoke weed. I mean, I've been a stoner my whole life. I've had periods of sobriety or whatever, but I'm a cannabis dude. I'm a psychedelic dude. So that that's my culture. That's my outlook. That's my mindset. So when I came out, I saw everything. I came to St. Louis, Missouri, so it wasn't really popping off here. But I had friends in California. It was still medical when I first got out, so I saw what was going on in California, and I saw what was going on in Denver, and I just started writing, man. I started writing. I started writing for Vice right when I first got out, and I was doing a lot of pieces. On drugs, psychedelics, cannabis reform, a lot of stuff on the criminal justice system. And you can bet as soon as I got off probation, I actually got off probation in 12 months because I was doing so good. So they let me off. I had 5 years probation, but they cut me loose after 12 months. And first thing I did was I hopped on a plane and went to Denver.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, because it was wrecked there. So, for me, I just wanted to go. I wanted to go in the shops, man. I wanted to have that experience. I'm like a stoner from the '80s. We were smoking brick weed and shit. We were lucky if we got like some nice kind of from California, and that usually would only be in the fall. The rest of the year we were smoking brick weed from Mexico. In the summer, sometimes you couldn't even get any weed. There would be like droughts every summer. Where they break out like the brown brick weed.
Mm-hmm.
They would barely get you high. But yeah. So as soon as I got off probation, jumped on a plane. I told my wife, I didn't even bring my wife. My wife, I've been with my wife since I was a fugitive, 1993. So, I've been with her 28 years. She did the whole 21 years with me, and as soon as, I got out, I came, lived with her. I've been with her ever since. That's my girl. So we've been together since 1993.
Wow.
But, yeah, but as soon as I got off probation, it was like, it was like the winter of 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and, I went to Denver, man. I flew to Denver, man. And, I had a buddy who lived there, that I was going to stay with, but I just went right to the airport. I took I took the train. They have like the train that goes down to the city. So I took the train down to the city and I just walked around and I started going to the shops, and I brought some cash. And that was still when they would have the weed in the jars, and you could look at the weed in the jars and they would take it out and weigh it for you right there. And so I just, I was like, okay, I'm going to buy some of this. I'm going to buy some of this. I went to about 3 or 4 shops. I bought a bunch of edibles and stuff too, because I never really ate edibles. And then I just I sat right on a bench, in downtown Denver, man, and started rolling up joints,
Mm-hmm.
And smoking it because my friend was a contractor. So he was working until 5 and, I got there early. And so I just hung out in Denver, walking the streets all day, kind of, smoking weed. I took some edibles. Then by the time my friend picked me up, I was fucked up. I was high like a motherfucker. I'd never done edibles. So the edibles were I was fuck.
Wow.
But, yeah, but definitely, man, it was definitely a trip, So I did that trip. And that was just, to me, it was like, I don't know. It was like, as a stoner, you just have to do things like that. After you do a long time in prison, that was just like something that was necessary. Not only did I want to do it, but it was necessary for me to do it, because this is a plant and this is a substance, that I championed, that I risked my life for, that I put myself in jeopardy for, just to supply, to other people. And not to say, I didn't make money, because I made money. Everybody, money is a good motivator, but I was more the type of person. I did stuff because I thought it was righteous. To me, LSD, mushrooms, and marijuana were the righteous drugs. I didn't think they should be illegal. I thought it was bullshit. So, that's why I sold them. I was at college age. That's what I did. I sold marijuana and LSD and mushrooms at colleges. That was kind of my thing. So definitely when I got out, I went to Denver. I flew home. And then 2 weeks later, I flew to San Francisco and stayed with one of my buddies there. The only thing when I went to Frisco, it was still medical. So, they hadn't, I think they had passed, the recreation, but the stores, was still medical. So that sucked because I couldn't go in the stores. But still, I went with my friend and, I just gave him money. He bought me, he had a medical card. So that was like my two big things I did right when I got off probation.
So, speaking of San Francisco, it's where we met each other, right? When we were doing the interviews for your documentary. So, I kind of wanted to talk to you about your creative work. You're working on a couple projects right now with regard to LSD, cannabis. You did White Boy, which we can talk about as well. So like why, this is obviously your passion, right? Like this is before prison, during prison, after prison. Like this is kind of seems to be like the themes around these substances and the trade and the culture are really like what enable you to like make art, and what it's almost like your muse as far as the way that I'm seeing it. So, what have you, especially with regard to the LSD documentary, why don't you just like tell us a little bit about that, and like what have you learned in doing it that maybe you didn't know through even just being in the culture of it for so long as well?
All right. So, I got this documentary. I've been calling it The Secret History of the LSD Trade, but maybe that title, might change. So, I got into it because, when I was a kid in the late 80s and I was on a lot, going to the shows. You just heard, you heard about all these legends. Of course, in psychedelic culture, we knew about the rum, knew about the Timothy Learys. These dudes were very well publicized. They had the books that we all read. They were on, different TV shows or documentaries or whatever that I watched. But there were these other dudes, like these more mysterious dudes, like these underground chemists, or like these, famous, distributors of LSD who, you would hear their names, you would never see them, but you would hear these guys' name, and everybody on the lot would talk about these guys like, reverently, and some of these guys were like, Owsley, like Owsley Bear Stanley. He was this dude. He was this underground chemist from the 60s. And then, he created the Wall of Sound for the Grateful Dead, and he was their sound man. And he was just like this counterculture, underground outlaw legend, and I started hearing about him on tour, and the people would talk about him. And I don't even think he was on tour, even working with the Grateful Dead. Then I'm not 100% sure, but you never saw this dude. People would just talk about him. And sometimes you see like the older, people who are my age now, who were back around in the 60s, and they would just tell like all these crazy stories about this guy. And he was so like mysterious, like there were like barely even any pictures of him. Mm-hmm. So it was just like crazy. And for me, being a cannabis and an LSD and a mushrooms guy, and, and a distributor, and, whatever they said, I'm a drug dealer, whatever they want to call me. That's what they called us back then. I emulated this dude because, we wanted to be that kind of outlaw counterculture figure, me and my friends. So like, I remember, I'd be like shying away. Oh, don't take my picture. because I wanted to be like Bear, because you never saw any pictures of Bear. So like you just heard his name. So I wanted to be the same type of dude. And there was this whole kind of like, mentality and mindset, on the scene with us who were in the drug trade. And, some of the other, big names that we heard about, like a Tim Scully, or like a Leonard Picard, like all these, underground chemists, or, guys like Mike Randall, these guys were just, these were like my heroes. I mean, you want to call them anti-heroes, whatever. But to me, these were like the legends of the culture. And like I say, I got a lot of my friends, like they're really into the Grateful Dead music. I mean, the Grateful Dead music, I was okay, but I was on the scene, for the culture, for the drugs, for the outlaw culture. That was my thing, I mean, the music was cool. I mean, but I like all types of music. I like hip hop. I like heavy metal. I'm not like, for the music, I'm not like a diehard Deadhead for the music. I've never been that type of dude, but I was there for the culture. I was there, I wanted to be these guys that I heard about, these legendary people that you never saw that were like invisible in real life. That's who I wanted to be.
I always say I'm in it for the shakedown. My friends keep inviting me to fish shows. I guess that's the closest you get nowadays. And I don't care about fish, but I want to go to the shakedown and meet people. I mean, that's really like where I think you get the characters.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a culture, man. It's a scene. That's what I gravitated towards. And, just, so I had all this knowledge, and then boom, I got whacked, went to prison, and I started writing in prison. So, but I still had like all this, this counterculture lore, this counterculture legend in my head. And, when I got in prison, I mean, there's some deadheads and some LSD, or weed guys in prison, but I mean, it wasn't a lot, I mean, when I first went there, the prison system was basically all African-American, for crack. I mean, that was a big thing they were going after. And then, you saw a lot of mafia dudes, a lot of gangsters, gangbangers, stuff like that. So I started seeing, all the kind of pop culture stuff that was, coming out around these guys, because it was, I was mostly on the East Coast. So there'd be like, Joe Smo mafia dude, like on my block. And everybody's talking about him. And I'm like, well, who's this dude? So, I call up my mom and she orders me the books or whatever. So I start reading the books on him. And then the same thing, with a lot of the, street legends or the Colombian drug lords or like the big gangbangers. I was in prison. So that was what I read. I was reading all that, like they call it true crime now, but I was reading all that stuff like when I first got locked up in the prisons in the early 90s. I was like a true crime junkie, but I was locked up with all these dudes. So I just wanted to read about them. They would tell me stories too, but I wanted to read, the other stuff. I was kind of obsessed with that kind of stuff. And as I'm kind of, in this world and reading all this stuff and around all these people, that's when I did, I started writing a lot about a lot of the African American, crack dealers, that were kind of lionized in hip hop lore, like gangster rap in the mid 90s that I was locked up with. And then, but the whole time, this counterculture, these legends of acid or like these chemists and all, it's like reverberating in my mind, it's in the background because, they're not front and center. You might, if you had like 3 deadheads on a compound, you were like lucky. You know what I'm saying? Because they had us all spread out. We knew each other and we knew who was a rat, who wasn't a rat. We knew where different people were, you know what I'm saying? Because we had that type of community and that type of communication. But it wasn't a lot. It wasn't front and center, but that was still my culture. So the whole time that was like going on, in the back of my mind. And, I started writing all these different books. I started writing, about myself. I started writing about, prison gangs, gangsters. And, I started, getting some success and recognition, from the outside world. But at the same time, like my culture, like what I was about, was still like in my mind. And so probably about, 10, 15 years in, I'm like, man, I get this idea, that I want to do this LSD doc. And I'm watching too, because sometimes like when you get ideas, like you're in there, And I'm watching what's going on in the world, and I'm like hoping in my mind, I'm like, man, I hope nobody, takes this idea and does it before I get out.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just waiting, and I'm planning it. And, I get my master's degree, and my master's degree was like really like, script writing, film heavy, cinematic type courses. My master's degree is like basically liberal arts, but, I kind of concentrated on all the film stuff as much as I could in there, no hands-on stuff, but, just like learning, writing, stuff like that. And so, I had this idea in my head basically the whole time since the early 90s. And then I got out, I started doing a lot of journalism for Vice, making money, kind of living, getting my life back together. Luckily, right when I came out, Making a Murder had just blew up. So it was like, I got out 2015, like right when kind of true crime is like blowing up. And plus I had this backlog. I had all these books that I wrote in prison, all these articles on true crime. So a lot of filmmakers started coming at me, because they want, they want to come at me and, get me to be in their documentary or talk or see what kind of ideas or what type of access. And through that whole thing, I hooked up with Sean Reck in Transition Studios, and I made White Boy. And Sean Reck really took me under his wing and, mentored me. He's a nine-time Emmy-winning director, regional, like Ohio, not national, but he won 9 Emmys in Ohio State for his work. And he mentored me and trained me and took me under his wing when we made White Boy and showed me how to make a film. I knew how to write, I knew how to tell a story, but I didn't know how to make a film. But that whole time, I got this LSD idea in the back of my mind. And, I'm just waiting, I'm just waiting. And then, eventually, another one of my friends, Tim Tyler, who we actually I wrote about his case while he was in for Vice. And I had told him about this LSD doc idea I had while we were both still in, like writing back and forth. And
can you explain quickly who Tim Tyler is for the audience, like what his case was in a nutshell?
Yeah, Tim Tyler had a life sentence for LSD. He was around the same era as me, like late 80s, early 90s, same age as me. I never knew him on the street, but he was on the lot. So, I mean, he was, the same time in the same era, we were doing the same thing, but he got busted and he got life sentence, where I only got 25 years. So he never thought he was getting out. And, I knew about him. I knew about his case. All of us LSD guys, we kind of knew each other, by reputation or through mutual friends inside, as people do time and get transferred and they say, oh yeah, so-and-so's here, so-and-so's here. So I knew about Tim. And then he got, there was a lot of, uproar about his case because he wasn't that big a drug dealer. He just got popped like 3 times in a row and he got like that 3 strikes you're out federal law and got a life sentence, for just, a couple thousand hits maybe. And so kind of the whole Grateful Dead community rallied behind him, to get him out. And eventually he was a nonviolent offender too. And eventually he got a pardon from Obama in 2018. So this is like when I'm out, I'm doing White Boy, I'm learning how to make documentaries, and I knew some people, but like I say, I knew who a lot of the people maybe that I wanted to get in contact with, but, I didn't have a direct connection to them. And then, Tim did though, because in the Grateful Dead community, I mean, everybody knows who Tim is. I mean, he's kind of like, I don't know if you want to call it famous or infamous, in the Grateful Dead community, because they kind of all banded together, to work on getting him out. And so when Tim got out, I knew Tim, had all these connections. So I knew because of the notoriety of his case and the pardon and stuff, I knew that he could open up a lot of doors and maybe I couldn't open, myself. So, especially with a lot of the elders in the community. So, and me and Tim, we had talked about this doc anyhow. I just, at the time, I never thought he was going to get out. So when he got out, I was kind of like, I saw that as a time. I'm like, okay, we're going to do this now. I'm like, bro, you're out. I'm like, I know how to do this. I go, I got a little bit of funding. So, I got with him and we contacted all the right people, and he made all the right right introductions, and we did the first shoot before COVID.
And
we did the first shoot at Mark McCloud's house
and for
in
those
San Francisco in
who
the
don't
Haight.
who don't know who Mark McCloud is, he's another one of these acid legends. He has the world's largest collection of LSD blotter art in his home living room in San Francisco. It's in the Mission, actually. And I wrote an article about him for Double Blind a little while ago, but he's a character if I ever met one.
An awesome article.
Yeah, it's awesome character, honestly. But one thing that I'm picking up on, and this is also through my own experience, I have a friend who's also, in the acid chemistry world, and reading, Roni Stanley's memoir. Roni Stanley was the longtime partner of Owsley Stanley. She has a child with him. And the memoir is called Owsley and Me, My LSD Family. And you hear about these acid families, right? Like other drugs have cartels. The whole distribution, production, whatever is centered around the cartel. You hear about that with, crack cocaine, other stuff. With the acid, it's the acid family. And so I wanted to kind of ask you, like, how is that representative of both LSD culture, but also the essence of the substance itself, right? Like, I think it's kind of engenders this communal, like, banding around a character, a person, the way you said people were banding around Tim to try to get him out of jail. The way, again, like Owsley was working with Roni and another one of his partners, Melissa, and it was sort of the three of them, and it's this little family, and others too in the LSD production distribution community. Just the culture is different, I would say.
Yeah, no, there's I knew about the families like way back in the late 80s, and that's what they do. They call it families, like how you said, and other things, they call it cartel, they call it a gang, they call it mafia. And I'm going to tell you that this is what the difference is. If you're in the cartel or you're in the mafia or you're in a gang and you snitch on people, a lot of times you're going to get killed. With this Grateful Dead family thing, I mean, it's nonviolent. I mean, these people are outlaws, they grow weed and, they deal in illicit substances, like LSD and mushrooms and stuff like that, But, I mean, there's tons of people, that have snitched on these cases, and none of these people have been killed.
Mm-hmm.
Just whatever. I mean, they get ostracized, they get, kicked out of the community. But, that it just shows the difference, that you were trying to hammer home, that's why these are called families and not gangs or drug cartels or mafia, because, when you're in a drug cartel or mafia, if you mess up some money, if you, a shipment doesn't go right,
mm-hmm.
If you rat, you get, but, in these families, that doesn't happen because, they look like families. People mess up stuff all the time. Maybe they don't let them deal in that trade anymore, but, I mean, stuff happens, and it's just not, the violence isn't there because it's the whole mindset. Like, we're pushing drugs. It should be legal anyhow,
Right.
And are legal now or are gaining legality now. So that's always been the mindset, like dudes like these chemists, like Barry and Leonard. I mean, they didn't mess with heroin. They didn't mess with cocaine. That was not their trade. Their trade was LSD. They were pushing something that can enlighten people. They can open people's minds. So, that's a big difference because you got to look at it. It's where you're coming from. A lot of the cartels, a lot of the mafias, a lot of the gangs. I mean, they're just trying to make money. And a lot of these dudes are crazy. They're just like violent psychopaths, and they get in these criminal families, and it allows them, to do what they do. Like they're looked up to for doing all this psychopath serial killer stuff, so that's where they're coming from. They're coming from chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Where with these families, the people that are, growing cannabis and pushing cannabis and making LSD and pushing psychedelics. It's coming from a totally different place. It's coming from a place like, look, we want world peace. If everybody trips on LSD, maybe we can have world peace. So, I mean, it's two different ends of the spectrum. The government, and society has branded us, all criminals and outlaws and put us all, on this side of the law. But it's two different spectrums, man. It's totally opposite. You can't even compare. Even in, as I've been, doing the interviews for the LSD trade doc I'm working on, I interviewed a famous DEA agent named Frank Panessa, and he's famous for going undercover with the mafia, right? That's like his claim to fame. He was a dude, he made the Pizza Connection case. So early in his career, and I interviewed him for this other doc I'm working on called Dope Men, which is about the mafia and heroin. And I didn't even know he had anything to do with LSD. And, I was telling him about this LSD project, and I showed him a little sizzle, and he was like, oh, he saw Al's, and he's like, oh yeah, I know that dude. I busted him like way back, in 1968. So this dude, like in the beginning of his career on the East Coast, when he first started going undercover before he got into the mafia stuff, he had busted Owsley. So, I got him on camera and I actually asked him, I was like, man, let me ask you some questions about him then. And he even told me one of the questions I asked him, I was like, look, man, what would you say the difference is between like these outlaws like Owsley and, these mafia guys? And he was like, man, it's night and day. He goes, these mafia dudes will like kill you for $1. He goes, this dude, Owsley, he was just doing something that he believed in. He was like, even when I arrested him, he just came with me. He was polite. He was like, I didn't have any fear that he was going to try to hurt me or, run away or anything. He was like a perfect gentleman. So, it just shows you the two extremes. And even though, society or law enforcement or the government will say, we're all on this side, I mean, we're really not. It's too big a difference. That's like, I go back to the thing, like, that I always tell people, I never considered myself a criminal.
Mm-hmm.
I've always considered myself an outlaw because I broke laws that I thought were wrong. I never carried a gun. I've never, been a violent dude except, to defend myself. I've never perpetrated violence. I've never had a criminal organization. I've never given orders or, ordered people to be beat up. That's what criminals do, that stuff. Criminal organizations do that type of stuff. That's what the mafia does. What I was involved in, outlaw stuff, with the Grateful Dead families. I mean, none of that stuff happens.
And, I'm kind of curious because like occupying sort of this middle ground between the LSD culture and, more kind of like drug cartel culture are people in the cannabis industry. Where there is outlaw culture, there are hippies, there's sort of people on all sides of the spectrum who are in it for various reasons. And so I know you're also working on some interviews and documentary project in regard to cannabis. So like, what are you seeing like as it compares like with both cannabis consciousness and cannabis culture as compared to these two sides of the, the acid versus like other drug spectrums?
Oh yeah. So I'm doing this other doc. It's called Tango Roots right now. It's going to be a docuseries too. And, it's about Southern Humboldt. It's about Humboldt County. It's about the Emerald Triangle. It goes all the way back, to the landers, into the war on drugs era, and the militarization of Humboldt County and the Emerald Triangle, all the way up to medical marijuana and legalization and what's going on now and how the small farmers are struggling. But I've known about Humboldt. I grew up in Southern California, so I knew about Humboldt since 1983. When I was on the East Coast, I was even getting Humboldt bud that was shipped out there, through my homeboys in San Francisco. So I even went to reggae on the river a couple of times in the late 80s. So, I knew all about Humboldt. It was always like this mythical, marijuana mecca to me. They grew this awesome, sun-grown organic, bud. But as I started doing this documentary, which I just started this summer, I found out, I knew about the Back to the Landers, and what they call the Back to the Landers were a lot of the hippies, the people from the psychedelic revolution, late 60s, early 70s, who just kind of wanted to like, fuck off basically. They didn't want the American dream. They didn't want the white picket fence. They didn't want to work for a big corporation. They didn't want to go to college. Some of them, a lot of them were college students, and they just quit and they call them back to the landers because they just moved out to Northern California. They had these big communes. They started growing weed, now, they've had kids and their kids have had kids. And so what I found out there, it's almost like this, it's outlaw, definitely outlaw culture. Like I really, the people out there, I really get along with them. We have a lot of the same values. We stand for a lot of the same things. I mean, these people, they stand by their convictions. There's not wishy-washy. I mean, you got to think, this was the area, Humboldt County, that was supplying 60% of the gross national domestic product, of cannabis in this country, ever since the 80s, like into the 90s, until recently. So, these people are diehard, they went through the war on drugs, it's a little area, Southern Humboldt, and it was targeted with helicopters, the DEA, the National Guard. They had all these things, Operation Green Sweep, everything. So, these are like a really sturdy, people who stand by what they believe in. And what I found out there, it's almost like this, like I say, all outlaws, but it's almost like, there's two groups. It's kind of like the cowboys and the hippies, but in a way they've kind of melded together, because the dudes from a lot of the dudes from Humboldt, they're country boys. Like they fish, the ones that don't have criminal convictions, they hunt, they shoot guns, they like their guns.
It's like the Wild West out there. Lots of pit bulls and guns and, people think
Rottweilers.
Yeah.
Dogs.
I spent a lot of time up in Humboldt, and it seems like they, it's not so much like the happy hippie culture that you get down in San Francisco. It's a little bit more rough. It's country living.
Yeah. Yeah. No, countries, but there's a hippie elements because half the people that went there were like the hippies that went out there and started their families. But it's almost like I tell people, it's like they're country boys. They drive trucks, they have guns, they like to fish. They have, Rottweilers, pit bulls, other big dogs. But at the same time, they like reggae. It's almost like they like reggae music. You got a bunch of deadheads up there too. But the ones that aren't deadheads, that's what they like reggae. They like to smoke weed. It's almost, I tell people it's like Duck Dynasty meets Cheech and Chong. And you kind of have these groups, that like, the hippies and the cowboys, but the cultures have kind of merged, and even some like, some people that I interviewed for that doc, that have legal farms now, like, they're straight country boys, but like their parents were the back to the landers. Their parents are still hippies. Mm-hmm. So that's how they were raised, but they were just raised, in this outlaw community. So, they're a little bit more hard edged, but like I say, a lot of the hippies, a lot of the Grateful Dead families are outlaws too. So, it's kind of the same thing. I think in Humboldt and Emerald Triangle, you do have a bad element there, but a lot of that bad element, it's outsiders that come in. Mm-hmm. A lot of the people that have been there, 2-3 generations, they're the type of people like their word is bond. If they tell you something, like you don't need a contract. If you do business with them, you don't need a contract. They honor their word. They're like some of the most honorable, down to earth, real people that you'd ever meet. But they've had to deal with all types of stuff because of the area, because, so many people have went up there to grow weed, with bad intentions, just sell it, criminals, cartels, so and the DEA, the government, they've had to deal with so much. But I'm telling you, some of the best people I've met, just like in the same regard, like with the LSD documentary and all the Grateful Dead family people, like the people you mentioned, like Mark and, Roni, and Tim and a lot of other people, that I've met through them. Just some of like, the best people, even, like I interviewed you and your dad, like your dad is like, just, he's one of the most real, honest people. Like, you just look at this guy, like this dude, your dad has been championing and fighting for weed and trying to help people that got busted. I mean, since like the late 60s. So it's just like, these people that take that stuff on themselves, man. And, they don't let society change them. They say, no, this is wrong. And I think that all goes back to like the be here now mentality, because when you open your mind and you get enlightened and you decide you're going to be here now, you don't need the government to tell you what's wrong. You can make your own decision. And that's what a lot of these people did in the 60s. They made their own decision. They followed Ram Dass and Timothy Leary's teaching, and they did the LSD from these underground chemists, like Owsley and Tim Scully and Leonard Picard. And, they said, this is wrong. We're going to make our own decision. We're going to be here now, and we're going to champion, this plant. We're going to champion psychedelics. We're going to champion this way of life, and we're going to stand. And if you look at it, down a tunnel from now till then, I mean, they took their stand. I mean, it took a long time, but they took their stand. But look where we're at now.
And I was going to say, the Back to the Land movement, I know a lot of the people up there also have been involved with stuff like Rainbow Gathering and, starting these sort of communes that, to me, having been to Rainbow, having also visited the Back to the Land communes up north, and, reporting on the movement of sort of communal living, that is like the truest expression of psychedelic values put into practice, right? Like when you're living in harmony with nature, with other people, kind of outside a system that, this is debate within the psychedelic world, whether capitalism and psychedelic consciousness are diametrically opposed. But when you're really like creating a life that in practice reflects the consciousness that you come to under the influence of cannabis and psychedelics and whatnot, like that, it really is like the promise of what we can do with this consciousness, right? Because is it just enough to be here now and drop acid, get high on weed, whatever? Or is it like, okay, so like, what do we do with that now? And so, if the here and now isn't something that you want to be in, if the system surrounding your present moment is something that you take issue with or isn't really reflective of your values, I think then it's like, okay, so what's next? And so for me, like seeing the cannabis culture up in Humboldt and in other places is really like a reflection of putting that all into practice and kind of blessing the present moment, the here and now with the effort that we want to see kind of like be the change you want to see in the world, right? So, that's the promise to me of like this kind of consciousness. And that's not to say that it doesn't come without like, a shadow side. And, it's not something we talked about so much here. Perhaps in your case, the biggest shadow side of cannabis and LSD is the potential to get busted, God forbid. But like, I think playing with like the different elements of what these substances kind of bring to the table and bring to mind and heart is really, what gives life meaning and what makes the culture what it is. And so for me, like that's what's been so exciting watching you do the work that you do and engaging with all of these characters is really learning from that and opening up to them. Just my take.
Yeah. No, I just try to, I'm not going to lie. The 21 years that I did in prison has given me access, to people that most filmmakers wouldn't get access to. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's been a boon in that regard. But I think too, people just take me. I'm just the type of person. I mean, I do stuff that I'm passionate about. So I've always been passionate about this culture. Cannabis and psychedelics. I've always been that type of dude. So now I want to share. My work, my documentary stuff is that's what it's just. I want to share, these stories, but also I want to educate people. I want to share it to the world. Why, I gravitate towards this stuff. Why I like this stuff. It's even like the same thing for the White Boy documentary that I did. I was writing about White Boy Rick's case and the injustices of it when I was in prison. Mm-hmm. I continued writing about it when I got out of prison. So when I had the opportunity to make the movie, I wanted him out of prison, so that's why I made the movie. I'm not gonna say, I wanted to learn how to make movies too. So, I had my own personal agenda, but, it was also the bigger picture. He shouldn't be locked up. So it's pretty much everything I do, there has to be that kind of theme and that passion behind it. Cause, like I say, I'm the type of person, I stand behind my convictions, and I stand firmly. And, if people don't like it, they don't like it. That's no problem with me. I'm not going to budge.
Yeah. Well, I respect that. So, is there anything else that we didn't talk about or you want to add or discuss or just get your word out on it?
I think we're good.
Cool.
I think we're good. Yeah. Look out, anybody, if you want to check out my books, if you want to read about, gangsters, SethFerranti.com, GorillaConvict.com.
What about on
check out my
social media also?
Oh yeah, Seth Ferranti, my name, SethFerranti. You can follow me. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I'm working on all these films. I got another film, Nightlife. It's going to be my directorial debut. That's going to come out probably early next year. It's actually about the violence here in North St. Louis. I followed a group of violence interrupters. This minister named the Reverend Kim McCoy. We follow him around at night. He walks the streets. He has an organization called Nightlife. They walk the streets from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. on Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights in the most violent areas of St. Louis. We follow them around for 2 years with cameras, and so that's his story. And, but it's also about a lot of the issues that have been plaguing our nation, police brutality, these areas, systematic oppression, institutional racism. This film is about all this stuff. And really the reason I made this film is because when I first went in 93, the federal prisons were 85% African Americans. And, the media wants to portray all these guys, the young black male, like they're all thugs, they're this or that. Man, I was in there with all these dudes. Some of these dudes, they're nerds. They like science fiction. They like comic books. They want to play Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm saying, man, people are people. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. It doesn't matter how you dress or how you talk or what type of music you like. So that's what I'm making this movie, Nightlife. I made it because, I've been with these guys. I know these guys. These guys, African Americans have been getting a bad rap in this country, since the jump. Mm-hmm. So, I'm trying to show, they're people like everybody else. And it doesn't matter what the color of your skin.
I hear you. And you mentioned, I just wanted to make sure you were saying something about your books as well.
Oh yeah. So I got all my books, Supreme Team, Prison Stories, Street Legends, Volume 1 and 2. I got a whole series of books on, African American gangsters. And I got a new book just came out called Criminal Escapades. It has a lot of articles, a lot of chapters on mafia guys, famous prison gangs like La MA, Mexican mafia, some biker gang stuff. So it kind of covers a whole gamut, of organized crime and gangs and gangsters. But that just came out actually October 10th.
Wow.
So,
congrats.
Yeah. So, I got a ton of stuff, man. I'm moving into films. I got all these films coming out now. So, I'm just, I don't know. Some people say I'm a really, great writer, awesome writer or whatever. But I just think, I'm very prolific. I know a lot of people that are way better writers than me. I'm just very prolific,
mm-hmm.
And I do quality stuff too. But, I know a lot of people that are way better writers than me, But
look,
I don't know,
you're getting the word out. Look, as from one writer to another and a journalist to another journalist. It's so in awe of the work that you do, and it's so prolific and it's so inspiring. And you have the right eye for the right people, and you're just telling stories that need to be told. And I can't think of too many other people who would do a better job of that. So really thank you for the work that you're doing. Yeah. And everyone in the audience, really like look up Seth, SethFerranti.com, and also on social media, and look out for the documentaries that he has coming out soon. And by the time this episode launches, we'll be able to also hopefully have more info on what's brewing. So thank you, Seth, and thank you everyone for listening.